number HOA, called Cops to Stop Me Fixing. My 150-year-old barn, so I raised utility costs for their whole area. Segment 1. The Hook. 250 words. The power went out at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, plunging 312 homes into darkness, while Regina Whitmore stood in my driveway waving legal documents like weapons of war. Her perfectly manicured finger jabbed toward my barn as she screamed about community standards and property values, but her voice got quieter with each second as air conditioners died throughout Meadowbrook Estates. "You can't just shut off our electricity because you're having a tantrum," she shrieked. But I could see the exact moment she realized that yes, I absolutely could. The sweat was already beading on her forehead as the August heat began its assault on houses that suddenly had no cooling. I stood there with my laptop still open, the utility management software displaying real-time power distribution across the subdivision. Every house north of Maple Street was now running on backup power that would last maybe 4 hours if they were lucky. Regina's McMansion was house number 47 on my list, and watching her face as understanding dawned was worth every minute of the legal hell she'd put me through. "This is extortion," she whispered, clutching those useless cease and desist orders. I smiled and closed the laptop. "No, Regina, this is scheduled maintenance. You should have read those easement agreements more carefully before you tried to steal my land." Segment 2. Background setup. 700-900 words. My name is Marcus Thornfield, but everyone calls me Mac. I'm 34, a grid systems engineer for the county, which means I understand how electricity flows through neighborhoods better than most people understand their morning coffee routine. 6 months ago, my father died from pancreatic cancer, leaving me his 40-acre farm that sits smack in the middle of what used to be empty farmland and is now called Meadowbrook Estates. The centerpiece of Dad's legacy wasn't the farmhouse or the field sit, was the barn. Built in 1874 by my great-great-grandfather. This wasn't just any barn. It was a cathedral of weathered wood and hand-forged iron, standing 30 feet tall with massive oak beams that could probably survive a tornado better than half the cookie-cutter houses surrounding it. Dad always said that barn held more history in its foundation stones than most museums keep in their entire collections. For 20 years, he'd been slowly restoring it every weekend, treating each board like a sacred relic. When the cancer got bad, he made me promise to finish what he started. That promise seemed straightforward until I discovered what had grown up around our property while I was away at college and building my career. Meadowbrook Estates hadn't existed when I was growing up. Back in 2010, Hartwell Properties bought up all the surrounding farmland and built 847 identical houses with pretentious names like the Wellington and the Ashford. They left our farm alone because Dad refused to sell, no matter how many zeros they added to their offers. He'd owned that land free and clear since inheriting it from Grandpa in 1987, and he wasn't about to let some developer turn our family heritage into suburban sprawl. The new residents loved looking at our farm from their kitchen windows right up until they decided our barn didn't match their aesthetic vision. I started restoration work on a Tuesday morning in late September, planning to repair the foundation, replace rotted siding, and reinforce the structure using historically appropriate materials. This wasn't some weekend hobby project. This was serious historical preservation. By Wednesday afternoon, I had my first visitor. Betty Chin, 67 years old, lived in the house closest to our property line. She brought homemade cookies and what she called friendly neighborhood concern. While we sat on my porch, she told me things that made my coffee taste suddenly bitter. The HOA had been planning something they called community enhancement initiatives for the past 2 years. According to several meetings I'd never been invited to, my barn was considered an eyesore that negatively impacted property values. Betty whispered that some residents had been pushing for eminent domain proceedings, claiming our farm was preventing proper development of the area. "They can't just take our land," I told her. But Betty's expression suggested maybe they could try. She mentioned that Regina Whitmore, the HOA president, had been very vocal about bringing the entire community up to modern standards. Regina was a former real estate attorney who'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates after a messy divorce. According to Betty, Regina treated the HOA presidency like running a small kingdom, with herself as the queen who decided what everyone's property should look like. That evening, I did research that made my stomach drop. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA had filed 347 complaints with the county in the past 3 years. They'd successfully forced 12 homeowners to change paint colors, remove garden structures, and modify landscaping. In 2023, they'd even gotten the county to condemn a resident's treehouse as a non-conforming structure. These people didn't mess around. They had money, lawyers, and the political support of 847 homeowners who wanted their property values protected. What they didn't have was any understanding of the infrastructure that made their comfortable suburban lives possible. Infrastructure that happened to run directly through the land they wanted to control. Number. Segment 3. Escalation. 1,600 words. Friday morning brought my introduction to Regina Whitmore herself. She arrived at 8:47 a.m. in a silver Lexus, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Regina was 52, blonde, and carried herself like someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will and legal intimidation. Mr. Thornfield, I'm Regina Whitmore, president of Meadowbrook Estates HOA. We need to discuss your construction activities, she announced, handing me a folder thick enough to use as a weapon. Her smile was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind lawyers practice in mirrors. The folder contained what she called comprehensive compliance documentation. But what I saw was 47 pages of legal ammunition designed to bury me in bureaucratic quicksand. Every single repair I'd made to the barn had been photographed, cataloged, and cross-referenced against HOA regulations that seemed specifically written to make restoration impossible. According to this document, my barn violated approximately 31 different guidelines, starting with non-conforming historical aesthetics and ending with incompatible rural design elements. The whole thing read like it was written by someone who'd never actually built anything but had strong opinions about how things should look. Mrs. Whitmore, this barn was here 136 years before your HOA existed. It's on my private property, and it's being restored using historically appropriate methods, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Regina's smile got sharper. Mr. Thornfield, I understand your emotional attachment, but community standards exist for everyone's benefit. Property values in Meadowbrook Estates have increased 23% since we implemented our architectural guidelines. Your project threatens that investment for 847 families. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of my barn taken from various angles, including some that had to be shot from inside other people's yards. We've had 34 complaints from residents about the visual impact of your construction activities. The roofing materials you're using don't match community standards, and the structural additions create an eyesore visible from 12 different properties. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a friendly neighborhood chat. This was a declaration of war delivered with corporate politeness and backed by legal threats. The next morning brought escalation. Regina returned with David Kim, introduced as the HOA's legal counsel, and Maria Santos, described as a community compliance specialist. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a coordinated legal assault. David handed me an official-looking document with county letterhead. Mr. Thornfield, this is a formal cease and desist order regarding all construction activities on the structure commonly known as the Thornfield Barn. Any continuation of work will result in daily fines of $500 plus legal fees for HOA enforcement actions. Maria added her threat with bureaucratic efficiency. We've also filed complaints with the county building department regarding unpermitted construction activities. An inspector will be conducting a full structural assessment within 72 hours. Any work that doesn't meet current building codes will need to be removed and rebuilt to compliance standards. The legal trap was elegant in its simplicity. Even though my barn predated every building code they could cite, any restoration work had to meet modern standards. The cost of bringing a 150-year-old structure up to current commercial building specifications would easily exceed $200,000, assuming it was even possible. If I couldn't afford the upgrades, the county could condemn the building as unsafe and order its demolition. Regina wasn't just trying to stop my restoration project. She was trying to force me to tear down my family's barn because I couldn't afford to make it comply with codes it was never designed to meet. Mr. Thornfield, we're simply ensuring community safety and property values, Regina said with practiced sincerity. If you find compliance costs prohibitive, the HOA would be willing to discuss purchase options for your property. And there it was, the real agenda. This wasn't about architectural guidelines or community standards. This was about forcing me to sell land that Regina and her development partners wanted to acquire for a fraction of its actual value. 2 days later, I refused to stop working. The morning brought another knock at my door, but this time, it wasn't Regina. It was the police. Officer Jake Morrison stood in front of my barn at 7:23 a.m. with a cease and desist order, looking about as comfortable as a vegetarian at a barbecue competition. I stood there with a hammer in my hand and 150 years of family history at my back, wondering how restoring my property had become a criminal matter. Jake was maybe 41, with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen enough neighborhood disputes to fill a small library. He handed me the official paperwork with genuine reluctance. "Mac, I'm sorry about this, but I've got to serve you with this order. The HOA filed a complaint claiming you're violating county building codes, and they've got enough legal documentation to choke a horse." Jake glanced around the barn with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship. "Hell of a structure you've got here. My grandfather would have loved working with wood like this." The irony wasn't lost on either of us, that he was being forced to stop me from preserving exactly the kind of building people pay good money to visit in historical parks. The cease and desist order was thorough enough to make a tax attorney weep. Every nail, every board, every repair had been cataloged and classified as either a building code violation or an unpermitted modification. According to the county, continuing any work without proper permits could result in daily fines up to $1,000 plus potential criminal charges for willful violation of building safety regulations. Regina had managed to turn restoration into a potential felony, but as I read through the legal documents, I started to notice something interesting about the timeline and the players involved. And that's when I began to understand that Regina might have made a very serious mistake. Segment 4. Preparation. 500-700 words. That afternoon, I took Jake's advice and dove deeper into the legal rabbit hole Regina had created. What I discovered made me question everything I thought I knew about this situation. Regina Whitmore wasn't just some suburban control freak with too much time on her hands. She was a former real estate attorney who'd specialized in property development law for 15 years before her divorce. Her ex-husband had gotten the law practice, the house, and custody of their daughter. Regina had gotten Meadowbrook Estates and what appeared to be a burning need to control everything she could get her hands on. But the really interesting discovery came from cross-referencing county records with HOA meeting minutes. Regina had been in contact with county officials about our property since February, 2 months before Dad passed away. She'd filed preliminary inquiries about agricultural zoning modifications and residential development opportunities while Dad was still alive and fighting cancer. The woman had been planning this takeover before my father was even in the ground. The deeper I dug, the more connections I found. Regina's former law firm, Hartwell & Associates, was the same firm that represented Hartwell Properties, the developer who'd built Meadowbrook Estates. Her ex-husband still worked there as a senior partner. The whole situation started looking less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a coordinated business strategy to acquire valuable land at below-market prices. Betty Chen provided missing pieces that evening, arriving with a box of documents that looked like evidence from a federal investigation. "Mac, I've been doing some research of my own, and Regina's been busier than a bee in a flower garden." Betty had obtained copies of Regina's communications with the county planning department, including emails that discussed community improvement initiatives and strategic property acquisitions. The most damning document was a proposal Regina had submitted to the county in April, just weeks after Dad's funeral. It outlined a Meadowbrook expansion project that would add 67 new homes, a community center, and a golf course on what was currently our farm. The projected timeline had construction beginning in early 2025, assuming successful acquisition of the Thornfield property. "How did you get these documents?" I asked Betty, who smiled with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Regina made a mistake. She thinks I'm just a harmless old lady who doesn't understand legal terminology. She doesn't know I worked for a law firm for 30 years before I retired. I know how to file Freedom of Information Act requests, and I know which county employees owe me favors." But Regina's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating Betty. It was underestimating me. That evening, I sat in the barn with my laptop, mapping out the infrastructure that served Meadowbrook Estates. As a grid systems engineer, I understood how electricity and water flowed through communities better than most people understood their plumbing. What I discovered made me sit back in my chair and reassess everything I thought I knew about my situation. Our property didn't just sit in the middle of Meadowbrook Estates geographically, it sat at the center of their entire utility infrastructure. The main electrical transformer that served 312 of the 847 homes was located on our land. Installed in 1952 when the utility company needed a central location for rural service. The primary water pump house that maintained pressure for the entire northern section of the development was also on our property. Built in 1967 when the county expanded water service to previously agricultural areas. Both installations had been built with perpetual easement agreements that gave the utility companies access to our land, but ownership and maintenance responsibility remained with whoever owned the property. That meant every time someone in Meadowbrook Estates turned on a light switch or flushed a toilet, they were depending on infrastructure that sat on land Regina wanted to buy, develop, and control. Regina had declared war on someone who controlled the electrical and water systems that made her entire neighborhood livable. She just didn't know it yet. Segment 5. Climax. Execution. 1,300 words. The beauty of being a grid systems engineer is that you understand power systems from the inside out. Regina wanted to play hardball with lawyers and regulations, but she'd forgotten that real power isn't in courtrooms or bank accounts, it's in the infrastructure that makes everything else possible. I spent Monday morning implementing what I called efficiency optimization of the utility systems running through our property. I wasn't violating any laws or damaging any equipment. I was simply using my professional knowledge to adjust system performance within legal parameters, ensuring that electrical and water delivery met minimum code requirements while operating at significantly reduced efficiency levels. The adjustments were subtle but effective. Voltage regulation that normally operated at optimal levels was reduced to minimum code compliance, creating harmonic oscillations that made electrical appliances work 25% harder to achieve the same results. Air conditioners ran longer to reach target temperatures. Refrigerators cycled more frequently to maintain cooling. Washing machines took additional time to complete cycles. The water system adjustments were equally strategic. I reduced pressure regulation to the minimum levels required by safety codes, creating flow restrictions that made dishwashers run extended cycles, reduced shower pressure to barely adequate levels, and forced irrigation systems to operate 30% longer to deliver the same amount of water. Every faucet, every toilet, every sprinkler system in the northern section of Meadowbrook Estates was suddenly working harder and delivering less. The beauty of professional-grade efficiency modifications was that they created problems without violating any regulations or causing obvious equipment failure. Residents noticed that their appliances weren't performing as well as usual, but there was no clear technical malfunction to report. Air conditioners struggled to cool homes during hot afternoons. Water pressure felt weak during morning showers, and utility bills started climbing without any obvious explanation. Regina's security guards, yes. She'd hired security guards to monitor my activities, documented my every move, but they couldn't photograph voltage regulation adjustments or pressure valve modifications that required professional equipment to detect. From their perspective, I was just doing routine maintenance work in areas where I had legitimate access rights. The first complaints reached the HOA office within 6 days. Residents called to report weak water pressure, poor air conditioning performance, and utility bills that had increased 35% without any obvious cause. Regina initially dismissed these complaints as unrelated maintenance issues, but the volume and consistency of problems suggested something more systematic was happening. By the second week, the HOA had received 127 formal complaints from residents whose utility bills had spiked dramatically while their service quality had deteriorated. Regina scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening at the community center, sending urgent notifications to all residents about utility system irregularities and the need for immediate community action. The meeting location was strategically chosen because the community center was served by the electrical transformer on our property, which meant every light, every microphone, and every air conditioning unit in the building depended on systems I controlled. The meeting started at 7 p.m. with 200-plus residents packed into a room designed for 150, creating standing room-only conditions that made the inadequate air conditioning even more noticeable. Regina opened with a presentation about infrastructure sabotage and deliberate service disruption that she claimed was being orchestrated by someone with technical knowledge and malicious intent. Ladies and gentlemen, We're dealing with someone who has both the technical capability and the legal access to disrupt utility services that serve our entire community," Regina announced with the dramatic flair of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "Mac Thornfield has threatened our property values through his illegal construction activities, and now he's retaliating against legitimate legal action by sabotaging the infrastructure that keeps our families safe and comfortable." That's when I stood up in the back of the room and asked for permission to address the community. The crowd turned to look at me like I was either the villain or the hero of their story, depending on their perspective. Regina tried to refuse my request, but the residents were so frustrated with their utility problems that they demanded to hear what I had to say. I walked to the front of the room carrying a laptop bag and a folder of documents that I placed on the presentation table with deliberate ceremony. The room fell silent as I connected my laptop to the projection system. "Regina has spent the last 3 months threatening legal action against my family's property while claiming to protect community interests," I began, displaying the first slide of my presentation. "Tonight, I'm going to show you exactly how she's been protecting your interests with your own money." The next 20 minutes were devastating for Regina. I displayed bank statements, transfer records, and legal invoices that showed exactly how Regina had been spending HOA funds on personal legal representation and development consulting. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Regina Whitmore had embezzled $47,000 from the HOA reserve fund to pay lawyers for her vendetta against my family's barn. But the financial evidence was just the opening act. The real revelation came when I displayed a real-time map of electrical and water distribution throughout Meadowbrook Estates, with our farm marked as the central hub for both systems. Every time you flip a light switch or turn on a faucet, you're depending on equipment that sits on the property Regina wants to demolish, I announced while displaying live utility data. The transformer station on our land is currently handling 847 kilowatts of demand from 312 homes, while the pump house maintains 67 psi of water pressure for the entire northern district. The room erupted in angry voices as residents realized their community fees had been funding Regina's legal war rather than the maintenance and improvements they'd been promised. But I wasn't finished yet. According to the original easement agreements from 1952 and 1967, any major modifications to electrical or water service require written consent from the property owner, I continued, displaying the legal documents. That means Regina's development plans are legally impossible without my signature. Regina stood frozen at the front of the room as residents began connecting the dots between their utility problems and her legal campaign against my property. She'd been threatening to force me off land that her entire community depended on for basic services, using money stolen from the same people who would suffer if her plans succeeded. "Tomorrow at 6 a.m., I'll be conducting essential maintenance work that will require an 8-hour power outage for this entire district," I announced, pulling out my phone to display the utility management app. "The utility company has been notified, county officials have been informed, and proper safety protocols will be followed." The room erupted in panicked voices as residents realized their neighborhood tyrant had been threatening someone who could turn off their electricity and water with complete legal protection. Segment 6. Resolution 400-500 Hertz. The planned maintenance outage ran from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. the following day, forcing the HOA's continuation meeting to relocate to the county community center 6 miles away. The meeting was powered by generator backup and attended by 240-plus residents who were now fully aware that their HOA president had been stealing their money while threatening the person who controlled their utilities. Betty Chen had organized a presentation that methodically documented Regina's financial misconduct, her illegal attempts to force property acquisition, and her complete failure to understand the legal and technical realities of community infrastructure. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, presented by residents who'd spent months wondering why their community fees were increasing while services deteriorated. The vote was 237-3 in favor of Regina's immediate removal from all HOA positions, with criminal referral to the county prosecutor for embezzlement and fraud charges. The 3 dissenting votes came from board members who'd been complicit in Regina's financial schemes and were facing their own legal consequences. Regina Whitmore left Meadowbrook Estates 2 weeks later, facing criminal charges and a civil lawsuit from residents seeking recovery of embezzled funds. Her development plans died with her HOA presidency, leaving my barn restoration project protected by both legal precedent and community support. The new HOA board unanimously approved my renovation plans and voted to designate the barn as a community historical landmark, complete with a plaque recognizing its significance to local heritage. Residents who'd once complained about property values now brought their children to see the restoration work, understanding that preserved history was more valuable than architectural conformity. My barn restoration was completed 6 months later using traditional materials and techniques that honored 150 years of family history. The structure now stands as a testament to the idea that some battles are won not through legal intimidation or financial pressure, but by understanding where real power comes from and using it responsibly. Every evening when I look out at Meadowbrook Estates, watching houses glow with electricity flowing through lines that cross our property, I smile. Sometimes real power isn't in legal documents, or bank account sits in knowing which switches control what, and having the wisdom to use that knowledge only when necessary. Regina learned the hard way that when you threaten someone's family legacy, you better make sure you understand what they're capable of defending it with. She thought she was fighting a farmer with a barn. She was actually fighting an engineer who controlled her entire neighborhood's infrastructure. The barn still stands, stronger than ever, and Regina Whitmore is just another cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the quiet guy who actually knows how things work.